Hi, welcome back to Weird Worlds. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Out of the Long Ago is a supernatural horror story follows Frank and his companion as they uncover an ancient evil after their friend is found brutally murdered. Facing terror and a creature from myth, they must confront primal fears and survival instincts while battling a nightmarish threat. Themes of fear, death, and sanity blur as they fight to survive. Out of the Long Ago by Seabury, Quinn. Weird Tales, January 1925. Author of Weird Crimes and The Phantom Farmhouse. Excerpts from the diary of Professor Simeon Warrener, Doctor of Science, Ph.D. September 20th. 2 letters in the afternoon mail, both requiring answers. Most important, a note from Morgan Carew, inviting me to come to Wales and join in some excavations he plans making this fall. He has stumbled over a promising-looking mound near the village of Cagnargith, not far from Chatsworth, and expects some interesting digging. There is a dolmen, in a pretty fair state of preservation on one of the hills, and Carew thinks some instructive kitchen middens will be found in the neighbourhood. The second is a favour from Alice Frassonet, asking me to tea at 4 tomorrow. I suppose I may curse Frank Sebring for that. Ever since he met the girl, he's been dancing attendance on her, singing my praises when other conversational topics failed. There are several drawbacks to having an assistant of the impressionable age. If it were not for Frank and the fact that Frassonet Pay is a liberal contributor to the Society for Anthropological Research, I'd ignore the invitation. But the boy is genuinely fond of me, besides being an able and conscientious assistant, so I shall accept both invitations. September 21st. Taking it all in all, Alice's party was a success. During the few moments I was able to pry Frank away, I told him my project to join Carew, and asked him to get his traps together as quickly as possible, as I want to leave before the autumn storms set in. I am not a good sailor. He seemed a little crestfallen at first, but a few minutes later came up all smiles and assured me he'd not only be delighted to go on the expedition, but to stay at Cagnargith long enough to dig to the centre of the earth, or clear through if I so desired. Frank is a good boy, but a little inclined to be flighty. If ever there were a born flirt, Alice Frassonet is she. Before the guests had thinned out, she allowed herself to be teased into singing, and, with Dora Carruthers' accompaniment, rendered The Land of the Sky Blue Water. I felt sorry for Frank. The little minx planted herself squarely in front of him, and sang as directly to him as any Broadway chorus girl tearing some hapless victim in the audience. The half-mythical story of some remote ancestor of Frank's who married a Mohawk woman in the days when Boston Common was a cow pasture is a standing joke among his friends, and Alice declared she was addressing the charming little ballad to the drop of redskin blood in him. Certainly, she succeeded in making him a temporary aborigine, for he was red as a boiled lobster from collar to hair before she brought the song to a close. Another incident that helped me through the dreary rounds of weak tea and vapid conversation was a story Sheila Tegu told me, which directly concerned Cagnargith. I chanced to mention my plan to go there with Frank to help Carew in his digging, and at the village's name she turned as white as though a chill had suddenly come on her. Thinking she was sickened with the fetid air, I was about to fetch her a glass of water when she begged me to sit with her and listen to an experience she had near the place 3 years before. I was stopping at a farmhouse about half a mile from the railway station, she began, doing some sketching at times, but mostly walking over the hills and moors about the village. One afternoon near sunset, I had set up my easel a few hundred feet from the station platform and was painting away industriously, trying to make my colours and the daylight come out even. I chanced to glance behind me and saw a queer-looking man sitting on a luggage truck near the station, gazing intently at me. There aren't more than half a dozen houses in all Cagnargith, you know, and anything in the shape of a stranger, even a tramp, is a sensation in the place. I thought I knew everyone, human and canine, in the village, but this loafer was new to me. I went on with my painting until the sun had gone behind the big hill where the dolmen is, and the air began to take on the twilight chill. Once or twice I glanced back out of the tail of my eye to see what my companion was up to, and each time I saw him sitting in the same stiffly upright position, gazing fixedly at me. As I folded up my easel and camp stool and started across the tracks for my boarding place, he rose and began to walk in the same direction. There was no hurry in his gait, Dr. Warriner, but I felt that he was all a-tremble and terribly eager to overtake me. I began to hasten a little, and with 2 long strides, positively, they were like an athlete's standing leaps. He lessened the distance between us by 15 feet, and I saw he'd be abreast of me before I could pass the water pit lying on the farther side of the railway. I hadn't noticed him particularly and couldn't see him very well in the gathering dusk, but there was something about that man that horrified me, though I couldn't say exactly what it was. He was tall, very tall, well over 6 feet, and startlingly thin, and seemed to be wearing a tight-fitting suit of shabby, fuzzy grey cloth. And though he walked directly on the gravel ballast of the roadbed, his feet made no sound. I hurried a few steps. Then, when I saw I couldn't possibly shake him, I determined to brazen the thing out and turned on him, asking angrily, "What do you mean by following me? Professor Warriner, if I live to be 100 years old, I'll never be able to forget that face." It was small and narrow and drawn to a point, almost like a dog's, and the teeth protruding from the great, wide mouth were long and yellow and hooked, like an animal's fangs. But the eyes were the most horrible part of it. They glowed and glowered at me like 2 discs of phosphorus in the half-light, and I remembered thinking for one awful moment, absurd as it may seem to you, of a quotation from Red Riding Hood. Do you remember where she asks the wolf, "What great eyes you have, grandmama," and "What great teeth you have, grandmama"? Those were the very words that popped into my mind, and their awful answers came running in their wake, like the echo of a horror. I'll never be able to look at a book of fairy tales again, without a shudder, for since that night the story of Red Riding Hood is a frightful ghost story to me, and a real one, a terribly real one. What the monster, I can't think of him as a man, would have done if he'd gotten to me, I don't know, and I don't like to speculate on it. But what I saw a few seconds later wakes me up screaming at night, sometimes even now. While he was still 15 or 20 feet away, a silly little grey rabbit popped out of its hole in the rocks beside the tracks and scudded between us. As it flew past, the thing caught sight of it and, seeming to forget me, gave chase. You know how fast a frightened rabbit can run, Professor? I assure you the poor little bunny didn't have a chance with that tall, lean pursuer on its track. He ran it down before it had covered 100 yards. I heard the poor thing scream as he crushed it in his long, bony fingers and lifted it, still struggling, to his mouth and tore it to bits with his teeth. I ran as I'd never run before to my cottage and got there more dead than alive, for every drop of blood in my veins seemed to be running cold as a night sweat. My landlady shook her head when I told her what I'd seen and said, "Don't ye go out o' nights nae mair, missy, for there do be bogles in the hills, and I've heard me grandfeyther say they crave human meat at times." Despite Shayla's earnestness, I could not forbear a grin. "We'll be looking for dead rabbit hunters, not live ones," I told her. "What you saw was probably some poor, half-starved tramp, maybe a lunatic escaped from some asylum." "No," she insisted, "it wasn't. Nothing human could have looked like that thing. Please, please, Professor Warriner, don't go to Cagnagith. I know something terrible will happen if you do. Why, I wouldn't go there, not even at midday, for all the money in the Bank of England." "Possibly," I assented, "but we're looking for something more valuable than money. We're digging for relics of a vanished civilization." To my astonishment, the little Irishwoman suddenly crossed herself. "Digging?" she almost shrieked. "Digging? And in those hills?" "Professor Warriner, you don't know what you're doing. The country people wouldn't put a spade in one of those mounds for anything. They say the body of a bug wolf is buried there, and to turn the sod would liberate its spirit. A bug wolf? I echoed. That accounts for the condition of the dolmen and mounds. Fear of the werewolf has probably kept the peasantry away. Carew told me that the excellent state of the land, archaeologically speaking, puzzled him. Your friend, the werewolf, or, as the Welshman will have it, the bug wolf, has performed a valuable service to science. I'll have to propose him for honorary membership in the Society for Anthropological Research. Ah, Dr. Warrener, don't make light, Sheila begged. You scientists who don't believe in God nor devil think you know everything, but you don't. These stories of ghosts and werewolves are as old as humanity itself. Surely there must be some truth in them, or they wouldn't have persisted so long. Well, I replied, if what you saw really was a wolf man, he'd better lie low while we're about. Frank Sebring is part Mohawk, you know. An ancestress of his was a woman of the totem of the bear, and the tribes claiming descent from the Great Bear, and those who had the wolf for their Manitou, were always at war. If I remember my pre-colonial history rightly, the bear people usually came out ahead too. Sheila twitched her shoulders as she rose, for all the world like a spaniel shaking the water from its fur. You'll be sorry if you dig in those hills, she warned. I'll be sorrier if the Society's Board of Governors learns that I knew about them and didn't dig there, I countered. Scientists of today are like bricklayers or carpenters, you know. So many bricks laid and so many nails driven, so much wages, so many scientific discoveries a year, a new appropriation, no discoveries, no salary. It's so much for so much, you know, and I think I'd rather brave your Welsh werewolf than the gaunt, grey wolf that accompanies an unpaid salary. With which bit of homely philosophy I bade Alice adieu, got my hat and stick, and left to pack for the trip. October 10th. Cagna Gith. And a dreary little hole it is. 6 or 8 sad-looking cottages cling with despondent tenacity to the hillsides rising from the shabby little railway station. A nervous little train fusses up to the platform twice a day, always threatening to deposit a stranger in our midst, and never doing it. Even the loafers at the public house wear an air of settled gloom. The only thing of interest in the neighbourhood is the great dolmen that crowns the tallest hill. There it stands, foursquare with the compass, frowning disdainfully upon these degenerate offspring of the once mighty Britons like an ancestral portrait regarding the family spendthrift. Carew has engaged a cottage a few minutes' walk from our digging grounds. A widow who boasts more wrinkles than I've ever seen in a human face lives a quarter-mile away and, for a consideration, cooks our meals and otherwise ministers to our wants. The remains of an ancient stone quarry lie about 100 yards from the dolmen. Here we have staked out a plot of promising ground. Tomorrow we commence digging. October 12th. Nothing remarkable. Our excavations have been more productive of disappointments than anything else. A few feet down we struck a stratum of coarse sand and gravel, and 1 or 2 bits of rough blue stone, clearly not indigenous to the neighbourhood. After that, water. If nothing further develops in the next 2 or 3 days, we shall move our operations to another hill. October 13th. No further discoveries of note. A few bones, apparently canine, came to light in the moist sand today. The weather is perceptibly cooler, and brisk winds spring up at dusk. Last night the breeze was so strong it rattled the doors and windows in a most annoying manner. Once or twice my lamp flickered and nearly went out. There is a chill quality in the air too which baffles all the efforts of our little fire to keep the room comfortable. Several times the gusts of air played so about the door I could have been certain a dog was snuffing at the crack. Yet when I flung the door open, there was nothing there. Our house must be in the path of some air current shot down between the hills, for I chanced to look out the window while the panes were rattling, and the fir trees on the hilltop were perfectly quiet. Frank has been very restless all day. Twice he left the work to go to the village, coming back each time with disappointment written large in his face. I suppose he has been expecting a letter from the Frassonet girl. October 14th. It is really most extraordinary, the way the wind seems to have singled out our cottage for its pranks. Just before dawn, I was awakened by the rattling of the casement. It shook and quivered till I thought someone was trying to force an entrance. Neither Carew nor Frank seemed disturbed by the noise, so I got up to investigate. Immediately I turned my flashlight on the window. The rattling ceased. The minute I left the window, the clatter recommenced. When I stood at the easement several minutes, the noise began at the back door. I hurried through the barren little kitchen and heard it at the front of the house. For several minutes, I played a sort of crazy blind man's buff. Finally, I cursed myself for a fool and crawled back to bed. But the wind's sharp, furious stabs persisted for some time, knocking at windows and doors, whining and whistling about the eaves and chimneys, and buffeting the walls. Almost as abruptly as it commenced, the racket ceased, and the absolute silence of the pre-dawn settled over the house. Old Mrs. Jones was laying the tea things when I came in a few minutes before the others this afternoon. "Be ye going to stop your digging soon?" she asked, swathing the earthen pot in a tea cosy. "No," I answered. "We've just commenced." "You'll not be digging by the quarry, though," she pursued. "Not much deeper." She avoided looking at me, but there was an almost feverish anxiety in her words. "We haven't found much there," I conceded. "We'll try somewhere else if the luck doesn't turn in a few days." The old woman busied herself with the toast and marmalade a moment. Then abruptly, "Did ye hear the dogs last night?" "Dogs?" I queried. "No. How do you mean?" "Oh," she evaded. "They was howling at something as was running through the hills. The wind, perhaps." "I certainly heard the wind," I assured her. "It raced round the house for an hour or more last night." "Is it a habit of Welsh dogs to bark at the wind?" "'Tis a habit of all dogs to bay the wind when there's evil in it," she answered seriously. 65 years, girl and woman. I've lived in these parts, and there's always trouble come to them as dug in the hills. I'm not saying it's true, but me faither used to tell of a bogle his faither had seen beside that heathen grave on the big mound. 'Tis some as says the old dead weren't buried deep enough, and they walks at night when their graves is scratched, and some says it's a bogle that watches beside the quarry. But none round here would strike a pick in the hills for love nor gold. When our dogs howls, we knows there's things abroad." "You think the dogs can see what you can't then?" I asked, amused at her earnestness. "Aye," she answered simply. "The dog sees what mortal's eyes can't, because there's no soul in him." I fumbled in my jacket pocket for my pipe, bringing out a small, hard object along with the briar. It was one of the bits of blue stone we'd dug from the quarry the day before. Tossing it on the mantel, I opened my tobacco pouch. "Where'd ye come by that?" Mrs. Jones was staring at the bit of blue rock as if she saw a spectre hovering over it. "Oh, that," I replied. "Why, we dug it from the gravel the other day. Odd, isn't it? No stone like it anywhere about. Can't figure how it got here." "Put it back tonight," she interrupted excitedly. "It's the bugwolf stone. Man, you don't know what you did when you took that bit of rock from the ground." "The bugwolf stone?" I echoed. "What do you mean?" She twisted the hem of her apron between her gnarled hands and swallowed painfully. "I'm a Christian woman, and I don't set much store by the old tales, but 'tis said a demon wolf used to roam the hills, killing all he met, and when the faithers killed his body, they buried it under a cairn of them magic stones to hold his spirit in. Man, ye unstopped a flask when ye took that stone from the earth. He'll be running loose again, a-prying at your doors and winders, and sometime he'll get in, and that'll be the death o' ye." I balanced the bit of rock in my palm a minute, then flipped it through the door. "Let him come for his confounded stone," I said contemptuously, reaching for a blazing splinter to light my pipe. The slamming of the door answered me. Mrs. Jones was scrambling down the path as fast as her old rheumatic legs would carry her. October 15th. Mrs. Jones has discharged us. Bribery, threats and entreaties are alike of no avail to bring her back. An offer to replace the blue stone mollified her temporarily, but when we went to look for it, The thing was nowhere to be found. I must have tossed it farther than I realized yesterday. October 18th. There are certain advantages in having an assistant of impressionable age. Alice Frazenet arrived this morning, bag and baggage, including her Aunt Anna. Frank has been of little practical use anyway, and the small loss of his assistance is more than compensated by Alice's services. Like the practical little person she is, Alice has taken up our care where Mrs. Jones left off, and we have already been treated to a batch of biscuits, real biscuits, American biscuits. The ladies have obtained lodgings at the Jones cottage, and if all the guile I can exercise will keep them there, they shall remain until we've completed our excavations. October 19th. Our first real find was made today. Grubbing in a half-hearted way, I unearthed what appeared to be a human tibia. In a few more strokes, we had an almost perfectly articulated skeleton out of the sand. Whoever possessed those bones in life must have been a human beanpole, for the limbs are disproportionately long. His hands and feet must have given him considerable trouble too, for their bones are half again as long as those of any modern man's. We laid the frame on a blanket beside the trench and searched about for the skull. Here the mystery began, for though we churned up the sand for yards around, we could find no head. Finally, after about an hour's search, we dug out a large dog's skull, which processed neatly upon the vertebrae. We shall pack these bones carefully and hold them to compare with further discoveries. Is it possible we have stumbled on the remnant of an ancient dog-headed people? Or did the old Druids have an unrecorded custom of burying the head of a dog with the malefactor in instances of capital punishment? It is too early to indulge even in hypotheses, but the possibilities are fraught with interest. Maybe we've dug up Sheila Teague's werewolf, Frank suggested as he and I packed the skeleton down the trail to our cottage. Maybe you're a fool, I told him. October 20th. Someone is interfering with our work. When we arrived at the quarry this morning, we found sand scratched into our trench, stakes pulled up, and several of our tools missing. Prints of large naked feet in the earth showed that the miscreant had removed his boots in an effort to hide his identity, though why he should have done this is more than I can understand. One pair of village boots is exactly like another to me. Toward evening, it blew up a rain. Carew and I smoked endless pipes and played endless games of cribbage. Frank went to the Jones cottage. It was nearly midnight when he burst in, drenched and excited. "I saw him," he exclaimed, flinging his dripping waterproof over a chair. "I saw him, but he got away." "Who?" Carew and I chorused. "The fellow who's been jazzing up our work. When I left the Jones house, that mongrel pup of the old lady set up an awful howling. You'd have thought his grandmother was dead from the noise he made. And I spied a suspicious-looking bird down the road. I kept my eye on him as I walked along, and when he left the trail and made for the quarry, I followed him. He went straight to our trench and got down on his all fours, scratching sand into the hole like a dog. I let out a yell and rushed him, but he saw me coming and streaked it across the hill." "What'd he look like?" asked Carew. "Darned if I know," Frank admitted. "It was raining so hard I couldn't get a good look at him at first, and he made off so fast when I yelled that I didn't get much of a line on him. All I can say for sure is that he's about a head taller than any of us, and thin as Job's turkey hen. His clothes looked skin-tight on him, and he was wearing a cap, I think, something with a long peak that stuck out in front of his face, and man, oh man, he surely could run." "Which way did he go?" I asked. "That's the funny part of it." Frank shook his head doubtfully. "I'd have sworn he ran right for our back door, but I lost sight of him by that little bunch of scrub down the path. Don't suppose either of you heard anything of him?" We talked the mystery over for half an hour, then went to bed for want of something more exciting. October 21. Carew is dead. Murdered. It seems incredible that this horror should have come upon us, yet as I write, the poor fellow's body lies by the wall. What a beastly, gruesome way of expressing themselves these Welsh have. Last night, after supper, Frank departed for the Jones cottage as usual, and Carew and I settled ourselves for a quiet game and a smoke. The tobacco canister went empty before we dealt half a dozen hands, so we cut to see who should go to the village for a fresh supply. I drew an ace, Carew a 10 spot. "Be back in half an hour," he promised, pulling on his cap and jacket. "And if I catch that chap who's been meddling with our diggings, it'll go hard with one of us." Poor Carew. It certainly went hard with him. 10 o'clock came. No sign of Carew. I played sullenly with my cold pipe and cursed his delay. Frank came in, midnight struck, still no Carew. "Hanged if I can stand this any longer," I said irritably. "I'm going to see what's keeping him." "I'll go with you," Frank volunteered. "This place is too all-fired spooky to stay in alone." We set off briskly through the chilly moonlight, keeping a sharp lookout for any signs of Carew and our tobacco. 15 minutes' walk brought us to the village tavern, where the sleepy Boniface paused long enough in ejecting a gin-soaked farmhand from the taproom to assure us Carew had not been there. Several interested spectators of the eviction proceedings corroborated him profanely. Here was a puzzle. Carew had been gone almost long enough to walk to Chatsworth, yet no one had seen him. Buying a couple of tins of tobacco, we hurried back along the trail. Out in the hills, we gave several long halloos, and the barren mounds shouted back our calls mockingly. "Do you suppose he could have gone over to the works and turned his ankle or something?" Frank hazarded. Not likely, but we'll have a look," I answered, as we left the path and struck across the hill for the quarry. "That's where I saw that fellow scratching in the sand." Frank indicated the head of white earth beside our trench. He was down on his knees, making his hands go like a pair of, "Hello, what's that?" He pointed to a dark object lying on the sand pile. I broke into a run without answering, for I had a presentiment of what we'd find. Carew sprawled upon his back, his outstretched hands clutching at the yielding sand, one knee slightly flexed, the other leg hanging limply over the lip of the trench. His throat and chest were horribly lacerated, as though he had been worried by some animal of incomparable ferocity. Across his cheeks and brow, several hideous gashes wrote the story of his death struggle. But the most appalling thing was the expression of unspeakable horror stamped on his features. It was as if he had looked one awful moment on the bare-boned grisliness of death before the spirit was rent from his body. "My God!" Frank shrank against me, shivering with panic terror. "His face, man! Look at his face!" I dropped my handkerchief over my poor friend's head. I had no wish to look again. "We'd best notify the coroner," I said, half leading, half carrying Frank away. The boy was done in with fear. Never have I seen a man's nerve fail him so completely. The fussy, fat little coroner performed his duties with all the punctilio of a rural official today. Strangers in a strange land, we were more than half suspected of our friend's murder, and might have been held for the assizes but for a bit of evidence the post-mortem disclosed. Clinging to poor Carew's nails were a few small tufts of tawny grey hair. These, together with the terrible mangling of his throat, influenced the jury to return their strange verdict that Morgan Carew came to his death at the hands or teeth of some person or animal to your jurors unknown. The village undertaker has just left. Embalming is about as much a lost art here as it is in modern Egypt, so the coffin has been put in the unused kitchen, where no heat will hasten dissolution. There, beside the skeleton of the thing, man or devil we dug from the sand last week, is all that is mortal of my old friend. Tomorrow they ship the remains to England for burial. Carew had no near relatives. Frank and I shall go with the body and see it laid in the family vault at Mulbridge. October 22. What I saw last night simply could not have happened. And yet it did. Frank and I were sitting before the fire, watching the reflection from the coals fuse with the afternoon sunbeams on the hearth, each busy with his own thoughts, when a subdued clatter in the kitchen started us up together. The tiniest noises are magnified 100-fold in the house of death. The same thought was in both our minds as we made for the back room. The rats were at their devilish work. Frank took up a carving knife, big as a half-grown cutlass, as I swung the door open. I smiled at the action in spite of myself. The reflexes of elemental psychology are as unreasoning today as when our ancestors slunk naked through the primeval forests. Nothing but a blind desire to kill led to the seizure of that knife. A second's reflection would have told him that a knife is well nigh as useless against rats as a pointed finger. We searched the little cell of a room quickly. Nothing living, save a cricket which set up its mournful kercheek from a cranny in the stones, was there. The chest with the dog-headed skeleton lay by the cold, gaping fireplace. Carewe's coffin rested starkly under its black pall on a pair of sawhorses beside the wall. One of the candles, sputtering at its head, leaned a little in its socket. I straightened it, pressing the melting wax with my thumb to prevent it soiling the cloth. Frank half-seated himself on the rough deal table, gouging at the wood with the point of his absurd knife. A sudden current of air, icy cold, fluttered the candle flame and shook the hem of the coffin robe. Instinctively I felt another presence, some evil thing, that travelled in a chill of terror. Eyes seemed boring into me from behind, and I gripped the candelabrum savagely to suppress the desire to turn. Slowly, without moving my head, I turned my eyes on Frank. He was frowning morosely at the table, chipping bits of wood from it, as though intent on serious business. Rat-tat-tat! A sudden sharp clatter of knuckles against the window pane. I wheeled in my tracks, my breath gone hot and sulphurous with fear. Staring through the glass was a great shaggy-haired wolf, yet it was not a wolf. About the lupine jaws and cheeks were lines hideously reminiscent of a human face, and the phosphorescent glow of those monstrous eyes never shone in anything carnal. As I looked, the monster raised its head, and strangling horror gripped me as I saw a human neck beneath it. Very long and thin it was, corded and sinewed like the neck of a thing long dead, and covered with thick grey fur. Then a hand, hairy like the throat, and slender as a woman's, fingers tipped with blood-red nails, struck the glass again. I went sick with fear as I speculated how long the fragile glass would withstand it. The thing must have seen my terror, for the corners of its devilish eyes contracted in a malevolent smile, and a rim of scarlet tongue flicked its black muzzle. A moan behind me told Frank's abject terror. "Oh my God," he quavered. "That's the thing I saw the other night. That's the thing that killed Carewe." Sheila Teague was right. We dug up one of them, and the other has come for us. I swallowed at the dryness in my throat. Words were beyond me. "Professor," Frank had crawled across the floor and seized me by the knees. "Don't let it get in. For God's sake, don't let it in." I pressed the boy's shoulder, not so much to comfort him as to have the feel of something human under my hand. Then my fingers closed fiercely on him, as, high and sweet and very lovely, I heard Alice Frazanc's voice rising from the trail at the base of the hill. She had promised to look in on us before we left with Carewe's body, and bring us a plate of biscuits. Now she was coming blindly to meet this waiting horror. From the land of the sky-blue water, they brought a captive maid, perpetuating her old jest at Frank's Indian ancestry. She came singing up the path. The thing outside turned at the sound, its pointed ears cocked forward, the white of its teeth showing as its lips parted in anticipation of easy prey. Slowly, bending nearly double, it crept from the window, making for the clump of withered brush at the turn of the path, crouching to spring as Alice rounded the bend. I looked, horror-frozen in my place, waiting for the tragedy as the Christian martyrs must have watched the gratings lift from the lions' dens. Balancing the tray daintily, Alice approached the knot of shrubs. Silently as a shadow, the grey thing slipped into the path, barring her way with gaping jaws and red tongue lolling from its mouth. Slowly, jaws working with a horrible chewing motion, it advanced its hellish face nearer and nearer her throat. I tried to speak, to shriek my horror to the evening sky, but a paralyzing dust seemed to have gathered in my throat, and only a hoarse, inarticulate whisper came. Summoning all my strength, I took a step toward the window. The next instant I went reeling against the wall as a dark object hurtled past me. Dashing panes and sash to splinters, Frank took the window at a bound. The crash of falling glass was drowned in the yell he set up as he cleared the intervening distance with long, loose-limbed strides. It was Frank who charged that grey horror, yet it was not Frank. As Jekyll metamorphosed into Hyde, so a subtle physical change was wrought in him. It was a man no one in 10 generations had seen who rushed down the hillside. It was a cry no living white man had ever heard that he raised as he brandished his great knife. Ai tenyoye rono. Twice he repeated the blood-freezing yell, ending the second time with a crescendoed ai-ya. It was the Mohawk war whoop, the battle cry of the people of the Bear. It was a miracle of heredity I beheld, an atavism, a throwback, a reversion to type. Sleeping, but never dead, the long-forgotten character of his redskin ancestor had awakened in Frank Seabury at the challenge of danger to his beloved. Before us lived and breathed the personality of a Mohawk sachem, some warrior of the totem of the bear, whose moving passion was a hatred of the wolf people. Ai-ya! Ai-ya! The battle whoop rang out again. There was something horribly comic in the wolf thing's expression as it turned. Such a look of astonished rage the evil one might give at defiance from a lost soul. They sprang together, meeting in mid-air. The man-wolf struck swiftly, seeking to bury its fangs in Frank's throat. Frank's free hand sank in the coarse fur at the creature's gullet. The great knife described a half-circle, disappeared, rose and sank again, and again, and again. Stumbling, reeling, spewing blood, the bug-wolf staggered from the clinch, the light of battle fading in its eyes. "Eight, telin yoli ish rono ya." The bear had tasted blood, but not his fill. Again they closed. Once more the wolf thing sought to worry at Frank's throat. Again the huge knife rose and fell, blood dripping from its point and edge. And ever, as the murderous work went on, the war whoop of the Mohawk rent the mountain quiet. Taller by a head than Frank, the wolf thing began to sink. Slowly it went to its knees, to its side, to its back. Ai-ya! Like an executioner's scimitar, the great knife descended, traversing the bug-wolf's throat, a dye of rusty red staining the fur in its wake. Once more the blade circled the man-brute's head, and Frank Seabury, product of effete New England, college man and instructor in anthropology, rose and contemplated the scalp of his slain foe. Tucking the patch of fur in his belt, he seemed to notice Alice for the first time, where she stood, ash-white, beside the path. An instant he regarded her wonderingly, then abruptly tore his Norfolk jacket apart, spreading the open edges between his outstretched hands. It was the blanket holding, the age-old invitation of the Indian brave to his squaw. And Alice Frazenet, fox-trotting, bridge-playing, tea-drinking Alice Frazenet, laid her fluffy, empty little head against his breast. End of Out of the Long Ago by Seabury Quinn.